I'm really hoping this isn't a hot take. Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to a rambling discussion on the lost art of catharsis and how sometimes you shouldn't be reading just to escape. Now, I realize that by saying that, and by the title, some people might think that I dislike reading for escapism, that I am one of those literary snobs that is like, I must only read the big important books about the big important things. No. Reading for escapism has its value, has its uses, and can be very helpful in certain circumstances. What I'm specifically referring to is reading for catharsis, which is, you could argue, the other side of the coin. Catharsis, if you were unaware, is basically the act of releasing repressed emotions, usually very highly negative emotions like rage and grief, usually through the use of art, very famously music, or purposely watching a sad movie to get yourself to cry. And this is one of the big things that art can do for us, helping us to work through things and feel those emotions to then lessen how much we've repressed them in our heads. However, the online discourse in the last couple of years has definitely gone away from that in a major way. I distinctly remember in 2020, there was a giant discourse of a bunch of people saying, we don't want pandemic books, no plague books, none of that, don't want any of it, no big books. And so they didn't. People were like, hey, a lot of people don't want this. There are a couple mentions of quarantine in a few books I've read, but most of the time it's just to set it in the modern day and move forward, because at this point you kind of can't ignore it. We're 3 years on and it's still a thing. So if you're going to write contemporary, you kind of just have to accept that it's a thing. But because of this, because everyone was reading for escapism, reading purely for escapism became the norm. And it has its uses, like I mentioned before. I became a foster parent in 2020, and I work in special ed with the kids with behavioral disorders. I have had plenty of stress in my life that could only be gotten through escapism, through a temporary reprieve of whatever it was that was dragging me down. However, there was another point in my life in which I had big feelings in my head, and I kept trying to read for escapism, to escape it, when I should have read for catharsis, to work through it. And by not reading to work through it and instead reading to escape it, I in fact prolonged the problem and made it worse. Obligatory trigger warning here. I am going to be talking a lot about infertility. We are not going to be talking about specifically any pregnancy I had or miscarriage. I never even got that far. But if you want to click off of the video now, no bad feelings. Have a good one. So let's jump into specifically how trying to read for escapism when it came to infertility made it so much worse. I haven't talked about it in directly so many words on my channel a lot, but you may be aware that I was diagnosed with PCOS in October of 2021. And we had been trying for a baby on and off for a while before then. We kept trying after, and we finally stopped at about 3 years of trying, more or less. And when you're trying for a baby long term, people love to tell you all their hopeful stories. I cannot count the number of times I heard about a relative, friend, or neighbor that had been trying for a baby, and then they started fostering, and then after they started fostering, they got pregnant. Well, we started fostering, still no baby. I then heard all of the hopeful stories from people who were like, well, so-and-so had to try for 3 years before they had a baby. I got to the 3-year mark. Still nothing. I was on meds at that point, Metformin, specifically for PCOS. And if you've never been on Metformin, just imagine that your intestines are in pain all the time. All the time. I'm not going to get very descriptive, but the medicine is made to affect your entire digestive tract, and it affects your entire digestive tract. I was miserably sick on this medication. Many people who get prescribed it will often go off it in only a couple weeks because they can't handle the side effects. I've spoken to many people, both diabetic who the original medication was meant for, and other PCOS havers like myself, and it's just awful. And that's what I was on to try and make my body do the thing. Meanwhile, I am hearing more hopeful stories because they have always got to pull out the hopeful stories when you're infertile. And I heard people talking about how, oh, well, so-and-so had to try for 6, 7, 8 years. I heard these stories that were meant to be hopeful, that the baby would come eventually. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to scream and wail and weep because the idea that I would be at it for another 5 years made me miserable in a way that I can't describe to you effectively if you have not gone through something similar. Because when you are working through infertility, trying for a baby long-term without it working, there is a constant, never-ending drain on your mental, emotional battery that sticks with you day in and day out. Basically, it is a monthly cycle of getting really hopeful and getting really disappointed. Now, some months you may be able to temper your hopefulness and it won't be as bad when it inevitably doesn't happen. But often, there'll be that one month where, for no apparent reason, your body just feels slightly different, or you just got it in your head, this will be the one, and the disappointment of it inevitably not happening hits like a freight train. So obviously, I'm like, well, my primary mode of consuming media is books. That's how I consume almost all my stories. If I'm watching YouTube at this point, I do nonfiction stuff. I don't do story stuff. So I'm like, obviously, I'm going to read to escape. And therefore, dove headfirst into yet more hopeful stories. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried reading books as an infertile person, but it's not great. It's not great. Side note, but I've often noticed that in a lot of romances, those evil exes, the evil, horrible exes that do all the bad things, also tend to be infertile. Which, like, why? Why does that, like, why do we need to make the villains constantly infertile? That's not, fertility is not frickin' morality. But also, most of these stories, if infertility is brought up at all, if they ever bring up the fact that this character has been trying for a baby and it's not working, it will almost always end with a baby. That is it. That is how it ends. There is no happiness if there is no baby. And that was the method that I was stuck in. There is no happy ending if there is no baby. There is no happy ending if there is no baby. So here I am, feeling gross in my own body every day, taking meds that make me feel sick because it'll up the chance that we might conceive. And do you know what it's like to also have to try and conceive while your body feels gross? Not great. Not a fan. And taking in all these lies of there's no happy ending if the baby isn't there, which is what a lot of those escapism stories do. It is the escapist fantasy of the baby comes. And eventually I started having this little idea of, what if I can just have a good, fun, non-tragic life without ever conceiving the child? The other half of the fantasy escapism stories around infertility is, of course, adoption. Namely, the protagonist will usually end up adopting a young baby or just, like, stumbling across a young baby in the woods if we're talking like a high fantasy. And that's the answer to the problem. Because again, it's not a happy ending if it doesn't have a baby. However, in the real world, again, this does not have a simple and straightforward solution. Namely because the myth that you have probably heard of, there's so many babies that need homes, is completely false. There are not so many babies that need homes. In fact, I have actually met foster parents who became foster parents after waiting so long on private agency waiting lists that they basically gave up on it. It is years. There are way more people that want to adopt a baby than there are babies in need of adoption. And on top of that, modern day adoption agencies aren't that ethical at all. First of all, they're privatized. So they are making an actual profit off of the infants. And there are countless stories of people losing their children in highly unethical ways, especially people of color, especially indigenous people who are losing their babies over ludicrous accusations, and young mothers who were at the height of their emotions feeling horribly coerced because they're living in a state of poverty that no one is helping them out of, no one wants to help them out of, because if that young mother is helped out of that poverty, she won't want to give up the baby. And again, we have people on a waiting list that are paying thousands of dollars that will give this private agency a net profit if that child gets adopted. Yeah, I have been radicalized by adoptee TikTok, don't at me. But I personally, yes, do still intend one day on going back to fostering. We have currently withdrawn just because, again, I work in special ed and a bunch of stuff was happening. But I want to go back for, like, specifically the queer preteens and teens. But that's not the baby. That's not the story. And also, I don't want to wait till that point to feel like my life is fulfilled. But going back to the reading for escapism thing, one of the so fun aspects of infertility is the feeling that you are failing, that you are doing something wrong, that you have failed. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be like, but you're not. I know I'm not. I know it's not my fault that I was born in a body that has hyperandrogenism and is just against babies. Apparently, it felt like I was. It felt like I was failing every time one of my sisters or a friend or coworker seemed to get pregnant like that. I had both my sister and my sister-in-law announce pregnancies while I was trying for baby. My sister, twice, and they barely had to try for more than 2 months either time. And there's this element of, I am failing, I am doing something wrong. And fun fact, when you are reading stories, and all of the stories you are reading are other infertile people also getting pregnant, it just heightens that. I am doing something wrong, look at all these people getting pregnant, I fucked up, how can I fix this? And all of your brain power goes to fixing it. Eventually, my husband and I started talking about life outside of kids. We stopped saying, oh, well, we might be pregnant by next summer. We might have a kid by da-da-da-da. We stopped assuming that it was going to happen and said, okay, what kind of life do we want to lead now? What kind of plans and travel do we want to make now? And slowly but surely, we started building a life that didn't have a specific baby-shaped hole in it. I'm not going to say that we specifically patched it up, but we realized that, one, we liked having a lot of extra time in our lives. We had fostered for a while, and we have since withdrawn for right now, but we did foster a newborn right from the hospital to 6 months. So we know how much time babies take, and we know the heartache of having to say goodbye to a baby who's not going to remember you. Would not recommend. So we know how much time is lost, how much money is lost, and we had like foster parent resources with that baby. We had, for example, at least in our state, and I think in other states, being a foster parent automatically puts you available for WIC. And you get, of course, the reimbursement. You get a daycare reimbursement, although you do have to pick very specific daycares, like all of that kind of stuff. So we knew that there was a lot of money that would be going to another human. And we liked going to stores, local stores, and getting to shop and getting to buy art from like charity art stuff. And we liked it. And we liked being able to just decide that we're going to go out and do a thing without having to worry about childcare. And we started building a life, hobbies, and habits that did not require an infant or a child with us to feel complete. Again, we are still going to go back eventually when we feel at a better even keel, because we both work in education and it's not getting any better, guys. We do plan to go back specifically for queer preteens and teens. Specifically, I am bisexual. He works in a middle school. We both have that kind of desire. But we also kind of realized that that was the desire we always had in the first place. That the must have babies was honestly kind of something we put on ourselves. Because once we decided, you know what, we're done. We're good. I took literally one look through what it would have required to do IVF, and I was like, fuck no! I couldn't handle 6 months of Metformin. You think I'm gonna inject myself with the hormones and undergo a procedure for a chance something takes? No, not even a little bit. But once we finally were like, okay, we're good, we realized that all of our other desires for babiness kind of also ebbed. Like, I have held babies since we've decided this. I have, like, read books with babies, and I cannot explain to you how much better I feel about holding those babies and reading those books now that we're like, yeah, we're childless and we're good about it, because I'm no longer trying and failing at a thing. And I know someone unkind might be like, well, technically you failed. No, I could have succeeded at IVF. Maybe. And we do technically have the resources to go on it. But I just realized, I don't want a baby that bad. And then eventually I realized, I don't really need a baby at all. I am totally on board with being the weird aunt, okay? I already got the vibe. I already bring the gifts from Renaissance fairs to Christmas. Like, I got it. I will be the weird aunt. And eventually, I will be the fun foster mom for the queer kids. Like, I got it. I'm still looking forward to things, but now I am not constantly mentally drained with having to constantly console myself and feeling like I'm failing when compared to fictional characters. I wish I'd had the strength of mind earlier to seek out those stories about infertility that looked at the ugly parts, that looked at the hard parts, and asked the hard questions of what happens if the baby never comes, either through reproduction or adoption. What happens if life sans baby? But because I never wanted to read through it, I wanted to read away from it, I never gravitated towards those books. And as a result, I kept reaffirming the not having a baby is not an option in my head and prolonged it. By the end, by the time that my husband and I finally looked at each other and were like, yeah, I think I'm good, I had already been coming to that conclusion myself for a month. But I never had the courage to look at media that asked the same hard questions because I didn't want to deal with the hard questions. And I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in that. Now, again, am I saying that you should give up reading for escapism and only go read the hard books about the big pains and traumas, or that people who have trigger warnings should read the books directly about their trigger warnings? No, obviously not. I know a lot of people actually do go into books specifically with their triggers for that catharsis, and they use it as part of their healing journey. But I'm not going to be like forcing people to read about their own trauma, obviously. But I am saying that we need to encourage these kind of books to be made, because looking back, it was kind of bullshit that the community basically bullied authors into not writing about the thing that must have been on their mind the most. And now I've seen a lot of people complaining about there isn't a great book about quarantine. There isn't a great book about the pandemic in like a story sense. And no shit, Sherlock. All the authors were told not to write it. It was very hostile towards it. And even today we're still seeing things like people attacking queer authors for wanting to write about the struggles of being queer in a queerphobic world, and people of color that want to write about the racism and trauma and are getting like, no, only the happy books now. Like, it's okay to want catharsis through art. It's okay to want to broach those subjects and want to find your way through a thing to make your real life better, rather than only focusing on escaping your real life for microscopic pieces of time at a time. It's okay to read for both escapism and catharsis, for both relief and to work through it. And that is it. The rambling discussion was a little bit extra rambly this time, but thank you so much for watching. If you still are. Do you have any books that gave you great catharsis? Feel free to drop the Rex if it's not too personal. I would love to know. Is there anything, if you don't mind sharing, that you should be looking into, but you're still kind of hedging away from it? Please let me know down in the comments. I would love to hear about it. And with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.